My name is Annette Thacker-Bartlett, and I am with the OSSE Division of Teaching and Learning. I am joined today by members of the OSSE Division of Data Assessment and Accountability, the OSSE Division of K-12 Systems and Supports, and the OSSE Division of Student Transportation. Today is the monthly LEA Special Education Point of Contact webinar. Today we're going to start by briefly reviewing appropriate levels of SEDS access for non-public staff. Then we're going to talk about what your IEP teams need to be doing right now to ensure that every student has the appropriate ESY eligibility status on their finalized and current IEP. So it's going to be a refresher on how to determine eligibility for ESY, as well as eligibility for ESY transportation services, and how to get that documented in SEDS. I'm also going to give you an overview of the entire timeline for all ESY tasks that have to do with all the different data systems that are involved with ESY. And then I'm going to turn the time over to the Division of Student Transportation for a refresher training on how to use TOTE to submit those transportation requests for ESY. As well as a few announcements about some changes coming in the world of transportation later this year. All right, let's dig in. Let's talk about providing appropriate SEDS access to non-public staff. As you know, you play a key role in who has access to your students' SEDS files. In fact, you as the LEA Special Ed Point of Contact are the most important person, the most key player involved when it comes to who can access student-level data in SEDS. OSSE will never give access to student-level data in SEDS. Rather, OSSE just controls overall account access in general when it comes to non-publics. You are the one that determines what students appear in their account. And so that's an important role here. But you're not the only one involved. There's also the non-public SEDS point of contact who needs to be doing their part. And everything that I'm training you on today, we are also training the non-publics on and trying to share that information and create that awareness. And the OSSE help desk staff are also key players here. And as you know, you work with them in the OSSE support tool. So just a reminder about appropriate levels of access for training. Okay, here we go. Non-public staff access. So let's say that a non-public campus that has one of your students, one or more of your students attending, let's say they get a new staff member, and that new staff member needs access to SEDS. Perhaps they're a service provider and they need to start logging services so that we can get credit for this student's appearing, students receiving their services. If a non-public comes to you and says, hey, I need a SEDS account, do not create a SEDS account for them. Again, I repeat, you should never create a SEDS account for a non-public staff. That is the role of OSSE to do that. OSSE is the one that should. Now, technically you have the power to do that because as the LEA Special Ed POC, you have a lot of powers in SEDS, but please do not create a new account for a non-public staff member. Please defer over to OSSE to do that. Please remind the non-public that they need to request a SEDS aggregate account for their new staff member through the OSSE support tool. And then once that's set up, then you can go get to work on modifying their user account to provide them the level of access. Now, in some cases, there may be a non-public program where their non-public SEDS POC has recently left that campus to take a different job, and they don't have a SEDS POC who knows what's going on and who has access to the OSSE support tool, yet this new staff member desperately needs a SEDS account. In that case, you still should not create the account yourself, but rather, on behalf of the non-public, you, as the LEA Special Ed POC, you can go ahead and submit a request in the OSSE support tool. Even though it's technically not your job to do this, you can do this on behalf of that non-public just to help get the ball rolling if for some reason the non-public SEDS point of contact has recently left, or maybe it's a brand new non-public that has never before had kids from DC, and so they're just really starting from square one. Then you can go ahead and make that request on their behalf to have OSSE set up a SEDS account for this staff member. And once that account is set up, now you go in and you look up their profile in your user database for your LEA, and you modify their profile to ensure that it's an appropriate level of access. When you pull up any user's profile, you, as the LEA SPED POC, you have the ability to change the user type, and you have the ability to change the level of access for the campus level. Please, please, please make sure that a non-public staff member only has the box checked for their campus. If you check a box for another campus, including one of your LEA campuses, that will open up access to that non-public staff member to other potentially to other students that they should not have access to, which is a FERPA violation. So please, anytime you are trying to set up access for a non-public staff member, please make sure only their non-public campus is the box that is checked. And here are some common issues that arise. What happens is OSSE will set up the aggregate account, and then you'll go in and you'll mark the right campus or whatever, and you'll think that it's fine. And then the staff member at the non-public is still saying, I still can't see my students. I still can't see my students. And then they're getting frustrated because they can't log services. They can't get like the transportation set up, and it's just a whole domino effect. So here are some steps that we've shown these to you before. This is a refresher today because we're still seeing issues with this coming through the OSSE support tool where non-publics and LEAs, there's still some confusion about how to get that right level of access. So this is just a reminder to double check with your registrar to make sure the students attending campus is the right non-public campus. Make sure that the service provider at the non-public who's trying to get access, make sure that that service provider's user profile is correct. And again, you are the one that has control over the non-public staff member's user profile in SEDS. Nobody else at the non-public has that kind of access. You're the one that controls the user profiles for all non-public staff when they access your LEA's SEDS site through their aggregate account. Make sure that the right related service profile type is selected, as well as the CAN provides. The box is checked for what they can provide. Also, check the student's IEP and make sure that those services are actually prescribed on the IEP and that the student's actually assigned to that service provider's caseload. These are troubleshooting steps that you should work through together with the non-public SEDS POC to resolve. And if for some reason you still cannot resolve the access issue, then you should go ahead and reach out to OSSE through the OSSE support tool for further help in troubleshooting if these steps don't work. And just a reminder about limiting to the right user type. There's some user types, especially those with an asterisk by it, they provide access to multiple campuses, and these user types are never appropriate for a non-public staff member. So when you are modifying a non-public staff member's user profile, please make sure you only choose the specific user type role for what is appropriate for them. If they're a speech pathologist, that's what you pick. If they're somebody that just needs to have view only, that's what you pick. If they are, if you want them to be able to access SEDS but not do anything yet because you still want to train them, you can select the pre-training account access level as well. That's a user type that's available. And to do a quick check, so we just talked about what to do when new staff members come to the non-public for you to help them get set up. However, I do encourage you to do a user audit of the existing non-public staff members and all your staff members in SEDS. It's easy to pull up a list of your staff members if just going to the user in SEDS, go into the users tab, and you can just pull up a whole huge list and you can see quickly at a glance. It's easy to see if there's a certain user that has access to multiple campuses. Here's a screenshot here of an occupational therapist that has access to 17 campuses. Now, this could be somebody that literally goes around and serves students at 17 campuses, so this could be totally appropriate, or perhaps it's an error. Either way, we're asking for LEA special ed POCs to take a glance at their users and see that level of access at the campus level and make sure it's the appropriate level of access. Okay, now we're going to talk about extended school year certification process. Well, what does certification even mean? And what are the dates and deadlines for 2018? Well, let's talk about it. So as you know, you have to consider whether or not a student is eligible for ESY at least once a year. It's possible that a student's eligibility could change from year to year, depending on the level of progress the student is making, depending on what's going on with their areas of concern, their disabilities. It's possible that a student's eligibility status could change. That is why under federal law, the IDEA law, you are required to consider do that fresh consideration of whether or not a student belongs in ESY at least once a year. And a convenient time to do that is during the annual IEP meeting. And that's why it's built into the IEP process in SEDS. So each year here in DC, by the first Monday in May, we ask that there is a requirement that you certify by the first Monday in May. Several years ago, certifying for ESY meant that you turned in a bunch of paperwork to OSSE. But that was a few years ago. We've moved past that, and now everything you need to do is just taking action in certain data systems to prepare for ESY. But the deadline is still the first Monday in May to certify. And I'll share with you more details about exactly what needs to be done in each data system in just one moment. But the purpose of having this early deadline in the spring, even though ESY doesn't typically start for most programs until the summer, the purpose is to help you prepare, help the non-publics prepare, help OSSE prepare and plan ahead for staffing, for expenses. Transportation is a huge thing that we have to plan ahead on. So that's why there's always an early deadline in May to have all of your ESY tasks and decisions done in the various databases. So what does that look like to be totally certified for ESY? Well, instead of turning in paperwork and a signed signature form like you did several years ago, now it just means you are keeping up with everything is up to date and current in the data system. So for example, the ESY calendar and the bell times are updated and accurate in TOTE. All your students' IEPs are current and accurate for what they say for the ESY status. Everything about those students who do get transportation for ESY is up to date and accurate in TOTE, and all the requests for transportation have actually been submitted in TOTE by this deadline. Let's look at this table. This table spells it out a little more specifically. This is a new table you're seeing for the first time because we have just finalized some of these deadlines. Now don't get too overwhelmed. I tried to put everything that you're going to have to do for ESY all in one place, but it might not just be you. Some things on this chart are actually the responsibility of the LEA data manager, or perhaps you have a transportation point of contact who is separate from you. Some of you are lucky enough to have other staff supporting you with transportation, and some of you get to be the transportation POC and the data manager and the SPED POC all in one person, which is so fun, I know. So here we have, let's start from the top, SEDS. There's certain tasks that have to be done to prepare for ESY in SEDS. Most importantly, what you should be working on right now is making sure all of your students' IEPs are up to date and accurate for their ESY status, whether it says yes or no for ESY, and whether it says yes or no for ESY transportation. That is something you should have been working on throughout this whole school year as each student's annual IEP meeting has come up. Of course, if their IEP meeting is over and you need to change the status, you can easily do that through the IEP amendment process. The other tasks in SEDS that will come later are doing the service trackers and the progress reports for services received during ESY. And as you can see there, the earliest date you'll even be thinking about that is much later this year. So that's not really on your agenda right now, but I want to flag that that's coming later for ESY. Now for TOTE, transportation request forms, you can begin submitting those on March 19th. So not today, but just giving you a heads up so you can plan ahead, and you can see there's going to be a little under a 2-month window from March 19th through May 7th where you should be working on those transportation requests for students to receive transportation in TOTE. And at the end of today's webinar, we're providing a refresher training on exactly how you can do that so that you can get started in March and not wait until May to get those done. eSchool Plus is another data system that you actually might not have very much to do with. That could be more of an LEA data manager thing. So you need to touch base with your LEA data manager and remind them that they're going to have to upload your ESY calendar dates into the eSchool Plus calendar. Several other data systems at OSSE rely on eSchool Plus having accurate information in its calendar. So it's very important that you get that information into eSchool Plus as soon as possible, either beginning March 26th or thereafter. Some of you, your LEAs, are still doing some planning and trying to nail down those exact calendar dates. So I encourage you to have those conversations now so that you can get that calendar up to date in the spring as soon as that window opens up. And then there is another data system that has to do with ESY. This is not a new system. The SLED ESY module has been around for a couple years. This year it's expanding to do a little bit more than it has in the past. This year the module has been updated so that you will be able to actually input your ESY site locations directly into this module. And then you will have to assign each student who's eligible for ESY. You have to match them with that site location. And this is the same module where later in the year you'll be showing the attendance for ESY. You'll be indicating that overall attendance. There are situations where a student is eligible for ESY under the IDEA criteria, that a student will meet the eligibility criteria for ESY. And in that case, it is appropriate to designate yes on the IEP that they are eligible for ESY. However, in the SLED ESY module, there is a place to indicate if the parent is opting out of ESY. We do get those situations sometimes where a student qualifies for ESY, yet the parent is saying, sorry, the student's going to summer camp in Pennsylvania. They're not going to show up for ESY. And so there is a place that will be built into the SLED module where you can indicate that the parent is opting out, so that OSSE knows to not plan for that student to attend, yet you can still show that they are truly eligible for it on their IEP. And we're going to be providing training on that SLED ESY module later this spring, and we will announce those training dates to you at that time. We'll announce those training dates to you in plenty of time for you to have a heads up to send the appropriate staff members to that webinar where the training will be provided. Okay, so now let's talk quickly about, let me just check the question box, see if we have any questions. Okay, no questions so far. Moving on. I'm going to spend a couple minutes with a refresher training on how to determine that eligibility for ESY based on OSSE policy and the IDEA laws, and how to document that in SEDS, and then I will turn the time over to the transportation team. So this, and nothing about determining ESY status, nothing about that has changed for this year. The IDEA laws remain the same, the OSSE policies remain the same and have for a few years now, so there's no change in how you determine if a student is eligible or not for ESY. So this today is just a refresher. Again, as with all decisions around a student's IEP, you need to base those decisions on data and what you know about the student. That's why you use the IEP team approach. When it comes to ESY, we ask that you use at least 3 months of progress monitoring data. Here's some examples of that data. Now, if the student is brand new to your school and you have not been able to get your hands on progress monitoring data from the past, then you just do the best with what you have to predict whether or not the student will need ESY, just based on the limited data you have. But ideally, it's at least 3 months worth of progress monitoring data. This worksheet should look familiar. This is the ESY eligibility worksheet. It has to be filled out for every student every time you have an IEP meeting. Now, you may not fill out very much of this worksheet if it's very obvious that the student does not qualify for ESY. You might not get very far, and it might not be very much written on this worksheet before you upload it into SEDS. For a student that does qualify for ESY, I would expect to see a lot more written on this worksheet as you would move through each criteria to document that they qualify. So there's 3 criterion. You think about that you're supposed to consider that the IEP team, you're coming together and you're thinking about the impact of a break on the service. You think about breaks in the school year. There's short breaks, right? There's weekend breaks. There's slightly longer breaks, maybe 2 weeks off in December, maybe a week-long spring break. And then there's a really long break in the summer for most of your LEAs, a couple months off. And for most students, it's okay to take that time off. Us as adults, we also have regression and recruitment problems, right? You have a long weekend, you go on vacation, you come back and try to get back in the groove at work. We all experience regression. It's natural, and for all of us, it takes time for us to recoup and get back in the groove. But we're thinking about those students for which it takes an extraordinary amount of time to recover from a break. So the first criterion you're thinking of is the impact of the break on the service, and thinking about the critical skills. ESY is not just a blanket continuation of all the same services the student is getting during the school year. Rather, you're thinking specifically about certain skills. What is an essential critical skill that if this particular student, if they do not focus on this skill over this break, they're going to be so far behind and never be able to catch up. You're thinking about what are those skills. Does the student have a skill that is in jeopardy of this extreme regression and recruitment? And so the question you ask yourself is, because of the break in service, will this skill be jeopardized? And again, this is where you look to the past data. You can look at the rate of progress so far this school year, what's happened over like a shorter break, maybe in December or spring break, or do they have an emerging skill that they're on the brink of attaining the skill and the break is going to be very detrimental. You're kind of taking that into consideration. And at this point, you may decide for most students that ESY is not appropriate, that for most students, their skills, even most students with disabilities, their skill set will probably be fine with a break in service, but for some students, they will meet this criteria, and so then you'll move on and think about that degree of regression. And these three criteria, they kind of blend in one to another. They're not distinct. They all feed into each other. And again, you're thinking about regression. Will they backslide so much that they are not going to be able to catch up after the break? And you think about that likelihood of significant regression. Again, all students experience some regression. Students with disabilities, students without disabilities, adults in our own normal life, we all have regression. Monday morning is always rough for everybody. You're trying to get back in the groove. You need a little bit of time for recoupment. Regression is normal. So regression alone is not an indication that a child needs ESY services. However, if there is a certain critical skill that they're struggling with where there is a high likelihood of significant regression, then you would say yes for this criteria and document that on the worksheet. And then think about the time for recoupment. Is it going to take an extraordinary amount of time for that child to get back to where they were before the break happened? And here is an example of a child where it's going to take an extraordinary amount of time. That backsliding is going to be so severe that it's really going to impact their educational progress in a way that they do need ESY services. And I'm saying all this to you, not because you need to hear it, but because I want you to think about how you're going to go back to your schools and your LEA and train your staff. Everybody who sits on an IEP team meeting needs to understand what it means to do this analysis. And so if you want to take some of these slides and do like a little refresher training with your staff, or get out that ESY worksheet and just talk through a few examples with your staff, that could be some great training to provide to your staff around this time of year. So helpful discussion questions that an IEP team could use when they're thinking about ESY is thinking about is a child, if they don't have ESY, are they still going to make adequate progress and are they still going to benefit from their educational program? And if so, they probably don't need ESY. Is there a likelihood that a child's going to have to be put in a more restrictive placement if they are not in ESY? That is something to consider. And thinking about a child whose needs may have changed since the last time you had the IEP meeting. And again, I mentioned this before, if you've already had that annual review, but now it's later in the school year, you have a lot more data on the child, it is okay to go and amend the IEP to change the ESY status. In fact, if that's what needs to be done, you need to be doing that now. Now is the time to think about those kids who think something has changed and now they need ESY, but their IEP says no, or the opposite, where you said yes for ESY, and now several months have passed since you had that IEP meeting, the child's doing great, and you're like, wait a minute, maybe they don't actually need ESY. Then please go amend the IEP and change that ESY status. And there are ways to amend the IEP without having to hold a meeting. You can amend the IEP using the documented written agreement modality, where you're just filling out that paperwork in SEDS, sending it home to the parent with an explanation of like, hey, we want to change this on the IEP. Are you okay with that? They sign it, send it back. You can move forward with the amendment without having to hold a meeting. Of course, if the parent would like to meet to discuss, then you need to honor their request there. And then what about young children? There might be children who are 3-year-olds who turned 3 over the summer, and they may be coming to your LEA for the first time. You've never met these children. You don't know them. But the information you receive on the child, the data that you receive, is enough to show that they need ESY. Then if that child is enrolled they're a 3-year-old and they're going to be enrolled in your LEA in the fall, then you need to get in touch with the previous school and figure out what's going on with ESY and whether or not you have the obligation to provide that. Okay, documenting in SEDS. 4 questions. Here we go. So somebody asks, what does extraordinary mean? And so this is with regards to extraordinary time for recoupment. That's a great question. So it is up to the IEP team. Again, things aren't very black and white when it comes to eligibility decisions for students with disabilities because every student is different. If the IEP team is wrestling with what does it mean for an extraordinary level of recoupment, I would recommend looking at data, perhaps looking at what happened when a student had 2 weeks off in December. When they came back in January, were they so far behind that it was taking weeks and weeks for that student to catch back up, or they never really got back to where they were before the break? Or did it take a couple days, but then they kind of got back in the groove and kept going with their progress? So it is definitely open to interpretation by the IEP team, but you really need to make sure that those decisions are made based on the data you have on the student and not just the subjective views of the IEP team. And as with regards to an exact amount of time for a recoupment, extraordinary recoupment, there is not anything in the policy or the law that says a specific number of days or weeks. Like if it takes them for example, if it takes them more than 2 weeks to catch back up after a break, then they need ESY. And if less than 2 weeks, then not. There's not a black and white rule with regards to that. So it does depend on the student and the data that you have. And again, you're just looking at what you know about the student from past data, past evidence, and projecting to the future and trying to predict what will happen if that student has a couple months off in the summer. And for some students, they might be okay with like their math, but then maybe they need something for reading over the summer, or vice versa. Or maybe they're okay with their specialized instruction. They don't need school over the summer, but they might need a little bit of speech services over the summer. It looks different for every student, and the services you prescribe can look a lot different and be a lot more limited than what they would have during the school year. It should be just enough to keep them from having to experience that significant regression and extraordinary recoupment. Oh, and yes, somebody brings up a good point on the worksheet. A previous version of the worksheet was a little bit weird with the yes or no questioning. The yes or no here, let's see, can the student recoup? No, okay, you're right. The yes and the no are mixed up on this worksheet, so I apologize for that error. Just follow what makes sense with the worksheet to document the student meets all 3 criteria, then they are eligible. Thank you for catching that. Thank you for your questions. Okay, let's move on to talk reminders about how to document in SEDS. As you know, the ESY process is part of the annual IEP review, or it can be done as part of the amendment process. the worksheets here. We talked about the first worksheet. The second worksheet here is helping you determine if a student is eligible for ESY Transportation. You only need to go fill out this worksheet if you already said yes for ESY, and now you're trying to analyze whether or not they need ESY Transportation. And there's a series of questioning here that guides you through that. But essentially, let's see, we're going to talk about transportation in a minute. Okay, so the criteria worksheet, you fill it out and then you answer yes or no if the student is eligible for ESY. You mark yes or no in the box. And then if you say yes, you're going to need to put in some, just lost my screen here. Here we go. If you say yes, you're going to need to denote some goals to focus on during ESY and hours of services and related services. So again, ESY should not look exactly the same as your regular school year IEP goals and services. It should be much more limited. It should be focused only on those critical skills that the student really needs to focus on during the summer. So it's possible that you may only have one goal, and it's going to be more specific, more narrow in its focus than your school year goals. For services, it's possible that a student may not even need a related service over the summer that they have during the school year, or maybe they do need it, but it can be a smaller amount of time per week or per month. The specialized instruction hours can be shorter. It can look different. You can really think outside the box for ESY. There's no reason why the student doesn't have to be sitting in the same classroom with the same teachers doing the same thing that they did during the school year. Rather, you can think outside the box. What are the activities, or what kind of setting, or what kind of work do you have the student work on that will just help them make progress on certain critical skills over this break period? Again, it can look a lot different than the regular school year, and should look different than the regular school year. Transportation eligibility. You need to fill this out for every child who is eligible for ESY, because then you got to figure out if they're eligible for transportation. This worksheet aligns directly with the special education transportation policy. So essentially, if you're going through this worksheet, the questioning on this worksheet, it's essentially guiding you through what the policy would be having you think about. Essentially, if a student's going to be attending ESY in the same location where they attend the regular school year, and the student already qualifies for transportation during the regular school year, and nothing about their circumstances have changed, it's highly likely they're still going to qualify for transportation during ESY if it's at the same location and their circumstances are the same. It's when you start changing things up that it gets a little trickier, and this worksheet can help you go through that questioning. If ESY is going to be at a different location, then you have to do a little more analysis to think about whether or not transportation would be appropriate for this student for ESY compared to the regular school year, or if something about the student's circumstances have changed that would make that will cause you to have to do more full analysis instead of just marking the same thing that you mark for the school year for transportation. And again, this worksheet will walk you through it, and in SEDS you then document yes or no whether or not they need transportation. Now, just a reminder, marking yes or no in SEDS does not make a bus show up at the student's door ready to pick them up, okay? SEDS is the place where you document their eligibility for transportation, but it is not the place where you actually request for transportation route to be set up with the driver and the pickup time and a drop-off location and all those details. SEDS is not the place where you document that. That is in TOTE, the Transportation Online Tool for Education. But SEDS and TOTE, they're friends. They get together every night. They have a little party. They share information. If you mark yes on this box, and then you just let it sit there and you do not finalize the new IEP or the IEP amendment, TOTE will never know that you marked yes on this box, and TOTE will still think that the student does not need transportation. So whenever you mark yes for transportation in SEDS, please be sure to finalize that IEP or IEP amendment, and then that night SEDS and TOTE get together overnight and they share information. And then the next business day, when you log into TOTE, you will see that that student is now reflected in TOTE as a student who needs a transportation route to be set up. And that's where you go set that up, is in TOTE. And we'll get to that in just a minute. And also, again, I was just talking about this, but SEDS tries to make it easy, like if the student already has transportation during the regular school year and nothing about their circumstances or the location is changing, SEDS tries to make it easy for you to say, yes, they're still going to need ESY transportation and it will look identical to the regular school year. So that kind of helps pass along that information there. If you say no, if something about the location is different or the circumstances are different, then you will be prompted to fill in some more details about the transportation situation for the student. And here is an example of what it'll ask you about. And then, of course, remember the category of transportation needs to be selected, like which category. The transportation policy goes into much more detail about the 3 different categories of eligibility for transportation, if you'd like to read more about that. And to see if it's still appropriate. And just remember, independent student drop-off. This is an issue that happens a lot. A driver tries to drop the student off at somebody's house, and there's no parent there. The driver cannot drop that student off. Why? Because an independent student drop-off has not been authorized through the proper channels with all the proper paperwork. So one key to that is, first of all, making sure the student is 12 or older. Second of all, this can only happen if the student qualifies under the Accessing Special Programs category of eligibility. If a student is medically fragile or it's not safe for them to travel to school by themselves, if they have the structured transportation support, just because they're 12 doesn't change anything about it still being unsafe or being medically fragile. Those categories do not qualify for independent student drop-off. So if a parent is okay with a student being dropped off independently, please make sure this box is checked in SEDS, that the form is filled out. You download the form from SEDS, but you upload the form into TOTE. I'll say that again. The form is downloaded from SEDS, uploaded into TOTE. And so if anything about this isn't completed 100%, then you're going to have frustrated bus drivers, frustrated parents, frustrated students when the driver is not allowed to drop the student off independently at the end of the day. So please make sure you help parents understand this process and help them fill out the right paperwork. Okay, and then if the student is coming from out of state, there is a special intake process in SEDS using the out-of-state transfer student tab. And when it comes to ESY, it's rare, but it is possible that you'll get a student coming from out of state who needs ESY to be established fairly quickly, and so using the out-of-state transfer tab is a way to quickly set up ESY while you're still taking a longer amount of time to get to know the student and do a full IEP. And that is done under the Comparable Services tab. Okay, and here's a picture of what that looks like. I'm going to turn the time over to the TOTE team. So just as we already reviewed the different data systems for ESY. Oh, and a reminder to update your ESY calendar in SEDS, okay? We talked about the ESY calendar in eSchool Plus, but the ESY calendar in SEDS is your responsibility, not the data manager. The LEA data manager probably doesn't even know how to log into SEDS. You need to make sure the ESY calendar in SEDS is up to date, meaning the start and end dates, so that the progress reporting dates can be accurate, so related service logging can be accurate. So this is something that you can do right now. You don't need to wait until it gets closer to the summer. Today, you can log into SEDS and go double check your ESY calendar dates in SEDS under the calendar function that only you have access to as a SPED POC and make sure that's correct. Okay, now I'm going to turn the time over to the TOTE team. You will get a copy of these slides so that you can see some of these reports. These are just a reminder that you can generate a roster report from SLED showing all of the students who are eligible for ESY and eligible for ESY Transportation. This report actually could be really helpful to you if you're wondering, like, if you don't want to go through each student one by one and check their IEP status, you can generate this roster report and see very quickly how many students you have right now whose IEP says yes for ESY and yes for ESY Transportation. I encourage you to run this report on a pretty regular basis between now and ESY. All right, and now I'm going to turn the time over to the TOTE team. They have an exciting announcement.
All right, good morning, everyone. Douglas Johnson here. I know a lot of you spoke to me previously before on the TOTE support line. If you don't have the TOTE support line number, it's 202-576-5520. And also, if we have any people online that do not have access to TOTE that are with DCPS, please remember to email SPEDOTA. That email is SPEDOTA, SPEDA.dcps@dc.gov. Excuse me. And also, if we have non-pubs online as well, or public charters online as well, email us at dot.data@dc.gov, and we'll be able to give you access to TOTE there. Just make sure you let us know the person's role and responsibilities at your school and a good contact number for them. And lastly, if you have any changes to your school, such as, like, if you look at your information in the system, the principal name is wrong and you have a new principal and things of that nature, please email our Division of Data Management at OSSE.leadata@dc.gov, and they'll see your EMI form, and that EMI form will allow you to update information for your school. Okay, so we have some good news for you all, because I get calls from a lot of my great LEAs out there and my great special ed coordinators out there saying, Doug, this system gets on my nerve. Well, we heard you all, and we're transitioning to a new system for SY 2018-2019. So that will be replacing TOTE. Okay, so we'll have training and things come up to that nature. Right now, it'll be an integrated system, cloud-based system, and it'll help streamline and reduce data entry and things of that nature. But for right now, for ESY, and currently also, because we know every year we do ESY and SY concurrently with submitting transportation requests for the next year. So until we get the new system active, we will also have TOTE prepared to take all the ESY information, all the SY information as of right now. Okay, so the system will be ready for you to start submitting ESY and SY information March 19th. Again, that date is March 19th, when you can start submitting transportation requests for ESY and SY 2018-2019. So we'll have training dates coming up sooner than later for the new system, but be on the lookout. We'll have emails coming out to you sooner than later. So just to give you an overview. Okay, I'm sorry. We had a question for the TOTE support line number. The TOTE support line number is 202-576-5520. And any one of our great TOTE representatives will be able to assist you with any questions or anything that you have. So everyone should know that TOTE is the transportation online tool for educators. And what we use for that is the house LEA information, student information, but more importantly, that's where we log the information in so we can transport our students. To echo what Annette said earlier, make sure that the main thing we need for you all to do to make sure that they are eligible for transportation, and to make sure that their IEPs are finalized, because we have plenty of instances where people have did amendments and left their students' IEPs in draft mode, and that information isn't transferred if they are adding transportation to the student's IEP. So just make sure it's finalized, and also make sure that the pickup and drop-off addresses are correct, and also that the contact information for their guardians are good numbers for us as well, because we want to make sure that if there's an emergency or anything of that nature, we're able to get in contact with the parent, most importantly. So for the next couple of slides, we're just talking about certification. Certification is making sure that any kids that are eligible within your school that are going to have transportation for ESY or SY, just making sure the information is in the system updated with the contact information, addresses, and also with submitting your calendar information as well. So that's the main thing. We want to make sure that the calendars are correct and also the bell times for the entry and dismissal times as well, so we can pick up the kids and drop off the kids on time. And just make sure that if you do know your kid's ESY location, we'll make sure that that information is in there as well. So just making sure that all the information that you need for your students' transportation for ESY is correct. That's, our good certification process. So we want to make sure you can get all the kids' transportation submitted at a certain time. And we know some kids who aren't marked for ESY right now, they will might change before the deadline or after the deadline. So we understand that, but we want to get a majority of your information in as we can right now. So if you don't have access to TOTE, if you have access to TOTE, this is what the screen will look like when you're logging into the system. If you need to request permission, just send us an email and we'll just send your email back so we get your information in the system, and you just fill out this particular form just like this, and you'll get the confirmation email to give you access to the system. And this is a landing page for our TOTE system. So I wanted to do something different this year. Last year, we just went through the whole certification process, but I want to try to go through the process to allow you to answer the calendar this year. So if you have any questions, please let us know, and just stop me ahead of time if you have any questions. So the next couple of slides will be us showing you how to update your school calendar in the system and also submit a transportation request for a student. So once you get into the system, you'll select the schools table, and depending on how many schools are under your LEA, so say if you're like Friendship has plenty of different campuses. So if you're LEA at Friendship, most of the time you have access to all your campuses. Just select your particular campus. So you can have that, if you have that schooling information for ESY or SY, and you'll select your school, which is the second screenshot. And the third screenshot, once you get to your school information, you'll scroll all the way to the bottom and hit Add Term Calendar, okay? Once we add the term calendar, I'm using our special school here, OSSE Academy, as a screenshot. You'll select the related school. So in your case, whatever your LEA is, whatever your school is, you'll select your school. So our school for us is OSSE Academy. And right now, I know the term says 2017, 2018. That's because ESY 2018 and SY 2018, 2019 aren't active yet, but that'll be, if you're doing the calendar for ESY 2018, you'll select ESY 2018. And if you have a program name, most likely to be summer program or ESY 2018 program, you'll select that particular program name. Then you'll also select the reason why you're submitting the calendar, which will be either extended school year or new school year for the upcoming term. Once we get that information in the system, we'll just put the first day, last day in the system, and also we'll put in all the school calendar details, which will be the breaks and everything of that nature. So we have fall break, winter break, spring break, and also the summer break information as well. And this section right here, the school calendars, add school calendar section, this section is very important to make sure it's accurate, because we want to know what's the earliest time we can drop off a student. So if your bell time is 8 a.m., most likely, most of the schools I see, they'll start accepting kids into school around 7:30 or 7:45. So we want to make sure this section right here is as accurate as possible. With the instruction time, which is the time school starts, and also the dismissal time. And if you have any early dismissal days or early or alternative bail, because sometimes, certain kids might get out earlier than other school students, and certain students might stay later than other students. So we want to make sure you have that information there properly as well. And also, just in case if it might be a inclement weather day where They might say, hey, over the summer might be a hurricane watch, which I hope is not. Or even in the wintertime when we have, the school days when they're closed, and we want to know what jurisdiction that your school fall under. If the school makes a decision after your school is going to be open, just say it's a button that you can say school makes this is the decision. And then most of the time for ESY, there aren't any calendar exception days. But if you might have a calendar exception day for ESY, I would just say enter that day in there. But most of the time, we have all the calendar exception days for the regular school year. Okay. Then once you have the information locked and loaded, just go ahead and hit save and close. So after you submit a calendar, because it's no point of you trying to submit transportation requests without the calendar. We need that calendar for routing purposes. That's how our routing team routes. That gives us, like I said before, the drop-off times and the pickup times for the students. So we want to make sure that your bail time information for the school is correct. So once that information is saved and submitted, you're now able to submit a transportation request for your student. So the same landing page as well, instead of selecting the schools table, you'll select the students table. Then also you want to make sure that the student has ESY Transportation. So that's why I have that particular field highlighted. So if you thought it was updated on the IEP and it still says no, it could mean that your IEP is in a draft form and not finalized. So just if you see that saying no or not checked off yet, just make sure you just double check the IEP. Once we make sure that the student is eligible for ESY Transportation, we want to make sure that the student is going to the correct location. So this is this section right here for ESY placement and eligibility information. We want to make sure that information is correct. And also if the student needs special accommodations for the extended school year. It could be things have changed from regular school year to ESY. So we want to make sure all this information is updated correctly on their IEP, because the student accommodation section information comes from their IEP. So once we make sure that the correct school is selected and everything of that nature, and that the accommodations are correct, we can move down to the last section, which is add transportation request form. And we'll select that particular button. Once the new form is loaded, we want to make sure this is the actual transportation request form that we're going through right now. So we want to make sure that our student contact information is correct. So in this case, this student is her uncle. So he'll be the one who as the contact person for them. And we want to make sure that the terms and the reason for us submitting the transportation request is correct. And in this case, it'll be extended school year service because we're doing it for extended school year. After this section right here, we want to make sure we have the correct mode of transportation. The mode of transportation should be selected as DOT vehicle as well. So if the student needs AM pickup and PM drop off, we can mark yes for both. And we want to make sure that the addresses are correct for what the parents have given us and informed us of what the address should be. So if the student is being picked up every day, you'll select Monday through Friday. And make sure if it's not an alternative AM pickup, select no. If it is, you can select yes, and you'll have to put in that other address as well. And if the PM address is the same, you'll do the same in that way as well. And once these sections are completed, I always ask our special ed coordinators to make sure they just double check through all the information to make sure everything is accurate before we hit the save button. Once the save button is hit, the transportation request is submitted. And again, we have up to 10 days to route our kids, but we try to route before those 10 days. Okay. Were there any questions, Annette, about that process? No.
No questions.
I know we have a bunch of old pros on the phone. On the line, so I know you guys are good. So on this last slide right here, just remember that for ESY, the deadline is May the 7th. May the 7th, and also for school year 2018-2019, it's June the 4th. But we do encourage you all to get as many of your transportation requests in as possible. That helps us with our workforce. That helps us with knowing what equipment we will need and things of that nature. Because we know come the last day of school, some of you guys are gone and you're on vacation. So we want to try to get you to submit all the information as you can as possible. And again, if you have any questions or you need us, just always remember we're at the TOTE support line at 202-576-5520.
Thanks, Doug. And I do want to remind you that with this deadline for ESY, although we say you have to have your SEDS updated and your TOTE requests all done on the same day, you actually have to backwards plan a little bit better because, as we discussed, whatever you put into SEDS takes 24 hours or the next business day before it shows up in TOTE. So it's actually impossible for you, if you like to procrastinate or for some reason are delayed in being able to get that information into SEDS, it's impossible on Monday, May 7th to amend an IEP and submit a transportation request on that same day for the same student. Because if you do an IEP amendment and you finalize it on Monday, May 7th, and it changes the status to yes for ESY Transportation, it won't be until the next business day on Tuesday, May 8th, that you see that student pop up in TOTE and you're able to submit that transportation request form.
Correct.
So that's why I tried to kind of backwards map this for you. Let me go back to that table. Let me show this table one more time. That's why here up in SEDS, you will see this first line where it says finalize ESY on the IEP. I actually put the deadline of Friday, May 4th because it takes a business day. It's not until the next business day that you see that student pop up in TOTE if you changed something about their ESY transportation status. So I put an earlier deadline of Friday, May 4th, even though technically the deadline is Monday, May 7th, but because you can't do SEDS and TOTE on the same day for the same student. They only get together. SEDS and TOTE only talk to each other at night on weeknights.
Yep.
So that concludes our webinar for today. We are going, because there are questions, obviously with a new transportation system coming, there's going to be a lot of new training rolling out, a lot of new announcements around that. We will keep you updated with all the latest and greatest information every step along the way by sending you emails and by announcing things in these monthly webinars with regards to more details about that new transportation system for the new school year that's coming up, as well as training opportunities for that. We will also be announcing when you can get trained on how to use that ESY module in SLED if you are the person doing that, or it could be your data manager that will need that training instead. Next month, we will be meeting again in 4 weeks from today. Next month, we're going to spend some of the time talking about discipline for students with disabilities, and then share any updates on transportation, any more updates and announcements with regards to that. As just each month, we'll be sharing more on the transportation as it gets closer to the new school year. So, thank you. We'll stay on the line for a minute to answer any outstanding questions, and this recording will be posted online. Hopefully by Friday, if not by Monday, it'll be posted on the website, and you'll receive a follow-up email as well. Thank you for your participation today. We appreciate it, and have a great week.